Have you heard of the exposure triangle? If you have, you probably know that it's one of the most important things to understand in order to take great photos. In this video, we'll break it down into pieces, helping you to understand the exposure triangle so you can take great photos. My name is Chris, and this is another Photography Simplified video. In these videos, I do my best to simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take great photos. Let's learn all about the exposure triangle. Now, there are three sides or elements of the exposure triangle. The first is aperture. Aperture is the hole in your lens that can either close or open to allow more or less light. Aperture affects the exposure because when that hole is smaller, less light is going to be entering the camera's lens and hitting the sensor. When the aperture is wide and open, more light is going to enter and hit the sensor. Aperture is measured in f-stops. The bigger the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture opening is going to be. The second element of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open to take a photo. When it's closed, it blocks the light from hitting the sensor. When it's open, the light will hit the sensor. The shutter speed can be either fast, meaning it opens and closes very quickly, or slow, meaning it opens, stays open for a while, and then closes. A longer shutter speed will be a brighter image because more light is captured, and a faster shutter speed will typically be darker because it is capturing light quicker. Shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. A shutter speed could be something like 1/5000th of a second all the way to 2, 3, 4 whole seconds. The last element of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO is your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. We are not actually changing the amount of light, in this case, that hits our sensor or enters the camera. We are only changing the digital sensitivity to that light. When we increase the ISO number, we're making the camera more sensitive to light, and it'll be brighter. A lower ISO number will be less sensitive and darker. ISO is measured in numbers, and each time that number doubles, the sensitivity to light doubles as well. If you're finding this video helpful, by the way, please leave a like and subscribe so you can see my other beginner photography videos. I would encourage you to check out my playlist, Photography Simplified, for loads of videos on beginner topics that can help you understand your camera and take better photos. It's important to know that each of the elements of the exposure triangle don't only affect the exposure or brightness of your image, they also have artistic elements. Aperture, for instance, can affect the depth of field. As you change your aperture, you can have either more or less of your image in focus. Shutter speed can affect whether you freeze or capture motion or blur motion. And the ISO will affect the amount of noise in your image. Because each element of the exposure triangle also has an artistic element, it's important that you understand these key trade-offs. For instance, with aperture, you could open your aperture very wide if you wanted a brighter image. However, you're going to get a shallower depth of field. And the opposite is true. You could narrow your aperture for a darker image, but you're going to get a larger depth of field. With shutter speed, we have the trade-offs to either freeze or capture the motion. We can slow our shutter speed if we need to capture more light and want a brighter image, but we're also going to be capturing more motion blur and more motion. If we speed up our shutter speed, the image will be darker, but we're going to freeze motion. And last, the trade-offs of ISO. With ISO, a low ISO is going to avoid noise in our image, but it's going to be dark. And sometimes we're going to need to raise that ISO for a brighter image, but that may lead to a grainier or noisier looking photo. Those are all the trade-offs of the exposure triangle. So how do you know what settings to use? What I would suggest is to prioritize the artistic element that's important for your photo. If you're taking a portrait, focus on aperture so you can blur the background and change the rest of the settings to get the exposure you want. Or if you're trying to capture wildlife or sports, focus on the shutter speed. set it fast enough to freeze the action, and adjust the other settings to get the exposure you want, and so on. If this is helpful to you, by the way, check out my book, Photography Simplified.
If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information.
If you're still a little confused on the exposure triangle, that's okay. Imagine that you have all your camera settings set so your image is exactly exposed how you want it and you have the right brightness. But maybe your shutter speed isn't fast enough to freeze this action and you're trying to take a picture of wildlife. You'd want to speed up your shutter speed to freeze that action. However, now your image is going to be darker than it was. It's not going to be exposed correctly anymore. So we go to our other settings, the aperture or the ISO, and adjust those to get the exposure back to being how we want it to be, or exposed correctly. That's more or less how the exposure triangle works. It's going to be a learning process as you tweak settings in different situations to get the type of image that you want. Let's look at some examples of what settings you might use and how to apply the exposure triangle to get the type of photo that you want. It's important to note that you'll want to be in manual mode to be able to control all of the camera settings. That means your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's first look at an example of sports photography. In sports photography, we're going to want to prioritize a fast shutter speed to capture the motion. Let's say in this case we want to shoot at 1/1000th of a second to really freeze anything that's happened and eliminate any blurriness that might be happening because someone or something is moving fast throughout the frame. After we've set our fast shutter speed, we can then adjust the aperture and the ISO to get the exposure that we want. I generally recommend setting your aperture next and then the ISO last to get the exposure you want, while also avoiding adding too much noise into the image. So let's say we set an aperture of f4 and an ISO of 400. Next, let's say we want to do a long exposure to capture light trails. In this case, the most important element is going to be using a slow shutter speed to capture the motion of the car lights over time. Let's say we're going to choose the slowest shutter speed on this graphic of the exposure triangle of 2 seconds to capture the car as it moves from the bottom to the end of the frame, or from the end towards the frame in the other direction. After setting the shutter speed to 2 seconds, we can then set our aperture and our ISO. Let's set the aperture next, always leaving the ISO for last to eliminate adding noise to our image. We'll set the aperture at f8 in this case, and last, the ISO to 400 because it is a darker scene. We'll need to raise that ISO a bit to get the exposure that we want. Next, let's say we're doing a portrait image. In this case, we want the person to be the center of the image, the focus, and we want the background to be slightly blurred so that way it draws our eye and our attention to the subject. So in this case, depth of field is going to be really important, and we're going to prioritize aperture to get that shallow depth of field. So let's say we choose an aperture of something like f2.8 to get the depth of field shallow like we want, blurring that background. We can then set the shutter speed and the ISO to get the exposure that we want. Often when shooting portraits, you're going to be shooting handheld. So here it's also important to set a fast enough shutter speed that we don't capture any camera shake. So let's say we set the shutter speed to 1/500th of a second to avoid capturing any camera shake. Then we simply set the ISO wherever it needs to be to expose our image correctly. In this case, if we're shooting outdoors and it's bright enough, we can probably keep our ISO at 100 without having any under exposing of our image. Last, let's say we want to capture the Milky Way and do some astrophotography. In this case, we need to capture a lot of light. And so all of the settings here are going to be important, but there are different ways you could go about this. We're going to prioritize just capturing as much light as possible to see the stars. So let's start by opening up our aperture as much as we can. Let's say that the most our lens can open is f2.8. So we'll set the aperture to f2.8. And from there, let's set a long shutter speed. In this case, we're going to use, for the example, 30 seconds. From there, it may still not be enough to capture all of the light that we want. And often with astrophotography, we have to raise that ISO. It may create some extra noise, and that's okay. Sometimes you can remove it in editing and still get a very clear and beautiful image. So we would set the ISO, for our example, to 3200. To recap, the exposure triangle is made up of 3 elements: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The aperture controls how much light enters the camera's lens, so we can either open it wide, allowing more light, or make it narrow, allowing less light. However, aperture will also affect the depth of field in our image. Shutter speed is the second element, and shutter speed can be either long, capturing a lot of light, or fast, capturing little light. Shutter speed can also either freeze motion if it's fast, or capture motion with a slow shutter speed. The last element is ISO, which is our camera sensor sensitivity to light. It can be more sensitive, which will make the image brighter but also introduce noise, or less sensitive, which will limit the noise in our image but not be as bright of a photo. If you really want to make sure you have the exposure triangle topics nailed down, stick around for this quick knowledge check. It will help you to make sure you know and understand each of the important elements. Number 1, what is the artistic element of aperture? Is it A, motion blur, B, depth of field, or C, noise? The answer is B, depth of field. Remember that the trade-offs with aperture are having either a wide and brighter image with a shallow depth of field, or a narrow and darker image with a large depth of field. Number 2, what is the result of a high ISO? Is it A, noise, B, shallow depth of field, or C, motion blur? The answer is A, noise. Remember that as we increase our ISO, we'll increase the sensitivity to light, which will make the image brighter. However, we're doing so digitally, and that will introduce more noise into our image. 3, let's say that I wanted to blur a waterfall. I should use a slow shutter speed. True or false? The answer is true. Remember that a shutter speed that is slow will capture motion as it happens, and a fast shutter speed will freeze motion. 4, what combination will give me the brightest photo? Is it A, a narrow aperture, a slow shutter speed, and a high ISO? Or B, a wide aperture, a fast shutter speed, and a high ISO? Or C, a wide aperture, a slow shutter speed, and a high ISO? The answer is C, a wide aperture, a slow shutter speed, and a high ISO. Remember that the wider the aperture, the brighter, the slower the shutter speed, the brighter, and the higher the ISO, the more sensitive to light, and therefore the brighter. Hopefully this video was helpful for you. If you want to dive deeper into any of the elements of the exposure triangle, I have a separate video for each one, and please check out future videos on other topics as well. We'll see you in the next one.